Probably.
Ever since I was infamously paying a parking ticket, but really, I was checking for camp for Carly, and I showed up at a shamrock for a cure many years ago. And we met and have been friends and partners on different things, and paths across in a lot of different ways. And of course, Cameron comes with the Shamrockin' family, but they have a new project that they've been working on that they'll tell you all about. This is going to be a little bit of a different format than we usually do. You normally see, we'll have a panel and a couple of experts, but when Pam,
you do have a couple of experts.
Different experts. This is what I when Pam and Cam wrote this book, which they're going to talk about the contents of it soon. This just seemed like a really good fit for a lot of our folks, and we have 2 experts. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is listen, learn, and unfortunately, Pam will get into this, but when Pam's husband John passed away, it was so hard for so many of us. He was dear to a lot of people in this room, and I think you've taken between your Widows Who Wine group and the things that you've done, you've made London's house really solid. And so I can't thank you for being here. And
very awesome. Okay, do you want to introduce?
I'm Pam. You don't live with me anymore, so we don't live in Roswell anymore. He lives in Milton. I live in Roswell, and for many decades. And yeah, I have 4 kids, and as Laura said, my husband of 24 years. We started dating was 18. So I know the math. If you knew how old I was, wouldn't work out. But that's because we dated for 8.5 years before we got married. So we were together for a really long time. He passed away, and 4 years ago exactly, last week, from glioblastoma. And I'll get into that story a little bit more in a minute, but this project was kind of born out of that. So.
I'm Cameron, and I'm Cam's nephew. And John, I work for John of Phil's passing. Now I'm a wealth advisor of my own practice, and so Pam came to me and she said, we had a lot of issues happen after John's passing, and let's write them all down so we can help other people figure out how to avoid those issues. So that's where most of this content comes from. So quick disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only, and it's not tax, legal, financial advice, and you should talk to a professional before enacting any changes.
an expert, if you will.
An expert.
Some other expert.
Yeah, different.
So, after John died, John was a financial advisor, and he had glioblastoma, as I said, and he was diagnosed in October of 2018, and he was given 12 to 14 months to live, and he was amazing, worked his butt off, and lived 3 years. So we had time to plan, and he was a financial advisor, so we had a team. We had all the things in place we thought, knowing that the end was probably going to come. We held out hope, but knowing that it was probably not going to end well, and even given the team of people what he did for a living, time to prepare, the business of death, as I like to call it, was really hard. And all I could think about was, if it's this hard for me with time to prepare and a whole team of people, how does it work for someone who loses their loved one in a car accident or a heart attack, and they don't have a financial advisor as a husband, they don't have time to prepare? And I just kept thinking about that, like, how do you do this? And you're in a massive grief fog. I mean, I barely have any memories of that whole first year after he died. And you're trying to make massively important financial decisions that literally could change your life if not done properly in a really bad way. How do people do it? So that's why that I thought of doing this book, and I realized I was like, I'm a storyteller, but I'm not a financial advisor. So I lured Cameron reluctantly in. Yes, you. And so he came on board, thankfully, and co-wrote the book with me. And It's called Where's the Key to the Safe, and there's a really good reason for that, because I didn't know where the freaking key to the safe was. I mean, we had 3 years, didn't even know where the key was. And so, that, I mean, true story. When we finally found it, I keep saying we, because Cameron, because he worked with me.
And I looked there and I said, what do you mean you don't know where the key is?
Literally, what safe is, don't know where the key is. And when we did find it, I didn't know how to get into it, because it wasn't a simple, you know, it was a turn it this way, not like a gym locker, like a weird counterintuitive with the key,
you
and
gotta
turn on and off,
jimmy
and yeah, it's very complicated. We were literally YouTubing how to get into this stupid safe. And then when we got in there, the will that we found was, we'll get into that too. It was just that's where the trouble started. It was like from the beginning, you couldn't get into the safe where our important documents were. So and then, as you can see, I like to say it's very pretty. It's a very pretty book, and it's very aesthetically pleasing. And there's a reason for that, because after John died, he always encouraged me to be very looped in, and you got to know how this stuff works. You've got to come to the annual meetings. You got to do all this. I was like, no, you don't. That's your job. It's not my job. And so then I felt very vulnerable after he died. And I didn't have a relationship with our people, with the team that we had. So I was like, I'm not going to get taken advantage of. So I'm going to read all these books. And I did, and they were horribly boring and very sterile and cold and clinical and like all red or all black or all white, and it was very hard to take in the information because it was very sterile and boring. So we tried very hard to make it very much a storyteller vibe, and really like you're sitting down having a cup of coffee with a friend going over this stuff. So I'm very proud of how that turned out, because it was a very conscious effort to make it easier to take in.
And then once we got into it, we realized that we could write the best estate plan in the world, but if it's someone like Pam who wasn't used to running the household finances, a lot of the stuff is going to make sense anyways. So the book just started growing from there. So the first, I'd say 5 or 6 chapters is all basic financial literacy information that people should know, and how to be what we call the family treasurer. You know, how do you pay your bills? Where's money coming from? Where is it going? What accounts cover which expenses, that kind of thing. So it just kind of grew and grew and grew. The more stuff we thought about, we're like, oh, we should have that, we should have that.
Okay, so as you can see, well, you may have noticed, there are 10 chapters in the book, so there's a lot of stuff in there. And we don't have time to cover everything, so we just kind of pulled out the stuff that we thought would be most useful tonight. So the basics, and again, how to avoid the pitfalls of probate, how to set yourself up. And really, the book is not meant for after your person dies, although it's helpful. It's really meant to prepare yourself before your person dies. And by person, I mean anybody you have a financial tie to. So it could be your partner, it could be your kids, it could be your siblings, your parents, your business partner, whomever. Like how to get yourself set up so that all that stuff's done ahead of time and you're not trying to do it while you're grieving. So we're going to talk about the basics of that, engaging the next generation, because most of the people in here probably have kids. How to get them engaged in this whole process too, and you're in the family finances, taxes. What are the 2 things that are guaranteed in life? Taxes, death. So you gotta look at them, and then how to minimize the future inheritances of your heirs by playing the tax game properly, and then a bunch of resources about them too.
So first thing, what most people think of an estate planning is a will, and that's usually where people stop. They think they have a will in place, they think they're okay, right? And that's far from the truth. So your will is really just a catch-all, and it should be kind of your last resort. And it passes any assets that aren't named through either a trust or beneficiary designations, and it's something that we'll get into in a second, but it needs to be probated by court. That's a long, drawn-out process, and I'm sure some of you have some nightmare probate experiences. But yeah, the will is really, like I said, your catch-all. It's your last resort that you should have in place. So by no means, if you have a will, are you fully covered. A trust, there's tons and tons of different types of trusts. There's a bajillion ways that you can set up a trust. They're really customizable, and you can have them, pass your assets on in however way you want. They're great if you need to restrict heirs and protect them from themselves and not waste all their money, or if you want to give money to charity, or death, transfer on death, you can put those on bank accounts. And now in Georgia, you can actually put those on real estate. So that's a really nice benefit as well. These supersede your other estate planning documents. So it's really important that you update these and you get them correct. Because if your will says one thing, but your beneficiary designation says another thing, the bank or other financial institution will give your money to the beneficiary of that account, not what your will says.
Give the best example. My favorite example. The best example is, say you were married once, and you have it's an old Roth or IRA or anything, a bank account.
401k.
401k.
That's what I say all the time.
Yeah, and your ex happens to be on there, and you forget to change that. When you die, doesn't matter what your will says, your ex is getting that account. They're getting paid out.
I've seen that many, many times. So make sure you're updating those. Make sure that when you do a refresh on your estate plan, that everything matches your wishes, right? Power of attorney, there's two different types. You have your medical power of attorney, so that's someone that's going to be working with your healthcare professionals. If you're unable to make decisions for yourself, they're going to decide with your doctors how you should be treated medically. People really think that they do not necessitate in this case, so when you not want to be brought back. But yeah, they're there if you can't make cohesive or cognitive decisions for yourself. And what people don't know a lot of times is that doctors, right, their first job is to preserve life. So they might go against your wishes, and if you don't have your medical power of attorney there in place to be your advocate, the doctors might do something that you didn't want to happen, whether that's resuscitating you or putting you on, a breathing tube or a feeding tube or anything like that. So medical power of attorney is really important, and then the other one's your financial power of attorney. So this is the person that's going to be able to make financial decisions for you, and they're really going to act as you if you were incapacitated. So they're going to have access to your bank accounts and your investment accounts. They can make transactions for you. And this is really set up so that if you, let's say you were in a coma, but you were going to come out of it, that you don't get behind on your bills and end up in bankruptcy or anything like that. They can maintain your financial life while you're incapacitated. These don't come into play, like I've been saying, until you're unable to make decisions for yourself, right? So a lot of people are worried about relinquishing that power to somebody else, but it only comes into play if you can't make that decision yourself. Whether that's if you're incapacitated or, later in life you have Alzheimer's or something like that where you're not a sound mind. So very important, the two power of attorneys. Advanced medical directive. That's, different states have different documents, but in Georgia we have an advanced medical directive that combines your medical power of attorney, your do not resuscitate, and then your living will. And that really lays out all the different scenarios that you want or do not want medical treatment. And that's something that your medical power of attorney is going to reference with your healthcare professionals to make those healthcare decisions for you. And then lastly, this is super important, your HIPAA release form. So if you're over 18, your healthcare professionals aren't going to share your medical information with anybody, right? It's against HIPAA. And so it's important to have that HIPAA release form. And what a lot of people don't think about is when they have kids, right, and they go to college, if they're over 18, let's say they get a car accident on their way to school, the hospital will not tell you the information about whether your kid is, their status, right? So it's really important to have that set up for anybody that you want to have access to your medical records. That's, the core components. If you have this in place, most people are going to be okay. Trust is optional, but the other ones are not.
I guess maybe we add the one thing with the medical thing, because I just did all this, is thinking about the people in your life, especially the medical one, who will actually follow your wishes and not be emotionally hooked. Like if it's your kid, if you say, I don't want to be resuscitated, or I don't want to be, measures beyond, but you have to pick somebody who's you feel strongly enough won't be so emotional about it that they won't follow your orders.
Pick the kid who let you go.
Yeah, the kid is like, I don't think they're
And then what a lot of people get hung up on in doing these documents is that they feel either guilty about picking one person over the other, or they feel like they have to pick the one person to do all these jobs. That's not the case. You need to pick the best person for each one of the jobs. So your financial power of attorney is probably going to be different than your medical power of attorney, because you know people that make good financial decisions, and you know people that are going to follow your medical directive, right? And so it can be two different people, and you shouldn't feel guilty about choosing, you know, one sibling over the other or one kid over the other, because it's all about making that process easiest for your loved ones if you're not able to make the decision. So a good estate plan takes the decisions out of the picture. You've already made the decision, and these people are there to, you know, implement and make sure that your wishes are followed.
So I also have this question, but that changes almost yearly. So how often should you look at these?
Yeah. So I recommend to my clients that they're doing what I call like a fire drill every 3 years-ish. So you know, you're shopping your insurance, good time to also review your estate plan. And that's like every 2 to 3 years, or you know, another big trigger is moving states. So all these documents are state law based. So if you move states, you're going to want an attorney to review them, make sure that they're still valid, or just go ahead and redraft documents. Or you know, someone in the family passes away that was a part of your estate plan, or you have grandkids.
Like any life event.
Yeah,
Essentially, any big life event or moving is an event. So anytime you have a big life event, just consider that and be like, okay, let's go back and take a look. But at a minimum, every 3 years, take a look and just make sure everything's still.
And by fire drill, it's like, pretend, you know, either you're incapacitated or you pass away, what's going to happen? Read through your documents and then decide, is that still what I want to happen with, you know, my assets, my body, any of that stuff? Or are there, has my brain changed and I want to make some changes?
So all of these documents are state specific, even your will?
Yeah.
Okay. So we need to be able to tell our clients when we leave or come into Georgia, we need to.
Yeah, and we did a seminar in Florida in May, and they have a lot of weird laws. A lot of people move to Florida.
Yeah.
So, and they don't know this. And so there's things like your medical power of attorney or financial power of attorney, one of the two, or maybe both. They have to be either a direct relative or a resident of Florida, which is different than Georgia. Anyone can be your power of attorney. So there's stuff like that where different states have got those that people know that.
I just wanted to make a comment. Being in home care and skilled nursing, and I hear so much, especially if someone has dementia and then the wife dies before the dementia partner. And the POA was, how confusing that is, right? Because then the kids were not given, so then you have to get guardianship, and it's a nightmare. But I'm trying to tell everyone, especially in this room, all these conversations need to happen when everyone's healthy. I know Thanksgiving might not be the time.
Right, I think we're doing it right now.
It's just really, really important that the children or the aunts or whatever are all hearing what your needs are and your wants are, because if you don't have those discussions, it really does become
Also, what I see a lot in my line of work is that financial institutions love to invalidate financial power of attorneys. They'll say, oh, that's too old, we're not going to accept it. Even if you weren't going to change it to a different power of attorney, they're going to say, oh, I want a new one. So just think about that too. So if it's, you know, older than 2 or 3 years, maybe just go ahead and update it anyways, because let's say you got a car accident, your son or daughter goes to the bank and they're like, oh, that's too old, I'm not going to change that power of attorney. That puts you in a tough spot.
Why do they do that?
You know, they probably have some good reasons. I don't know. I would assume it's for fraud. That's all I can think about is like protects their customer from fraud, but I don't know. So choose your teams. So we just talked about kind of your personal team, right? Those are probably your friends or loved ones that are going to fill those roles, and then you also have your professional team, which is the other side of this.
Okay, so your professional relationships are really interesting to take into account. I already told you that I alluded that John did all of this stuff, so he had a relationship with the CPA, he had a relationship with a lawyer, he had a relationship with everybody. I didn't, and I regretted that. Even his staff, I knew them, of course, but it was more like the holiday parties and the, you know, whatever. And in retrospect, it would have been so much easier and comforting for me to go to our attorney and have a relationship already established. And so establish a relationship with your people. You know, the difference between your PAs or state attorney, so, and then your CPA, of course, is preparing your tax returns. You know, there's a difference between a tax preparer and a tax planner. Those serve different roles, you know, have a more a business or a bigger estate, you want somebody who's gonna plan for those tax implications versus just like filing with the IRS. So those are different things. Your attorney, of course, is gonna draft all your documents and help you with your estate planning, but again, having that relationship in place. And I'll tell you, with our attorney, he was an older gentleman, very, I'd say, set in his ways, and he was very adamant about following what John had already put in place, despite what I said. And I told you I read a lot, and I'm really glad that I read a lot before going into that meeting, because I understood what questions to ask, and there were definite things that needed to be changed. For instance, my oldest two have cystic fibrosis. When John put this plan together, we didn't know what the future held for Sia. So he had a special needs trust set up with our lawyer. And I literally had to fight with him, and I was like, we don't need that, thankfully, with advancements. We don't need that in place anymore. And he was like, yes, you do. Yes, you do. I'm like, no, I don't. But I wouldn't have known enough to ask those questions. And then, and of course, your wealth advisor, you know, that's a big part of our lives. My husband, my nephew, my child is now a CFP as well. So we're big proponents of that, because literally all of the meetings, so I've since fired my CPA and the lawyer and created my own team. And so I have my own people, and we have and it's awesome in there. And it literally is like, you know, we meet quarterly, if not more, but quarterly at least.
All of us.
With all, Gavin, Cameron, my CPA, what is Blake's even role? Yeah, Lisa and Blake. They're both like CPAs, but they're both on the phone.
I don't know, like, he's kind of boring.
And the estate attorney, like everybody's on, so we are streamlined. Before, you know, it was like I'd have to go to the CPA and say, this is what the attorney needs, this is what the financial advisor needs, and wait for everybody to email back and be on the same page. These guys are on the same page, boom, 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 everything is like locked and loaded. It's so good. So, you know, I would say even if you have somebody in place, like think about those relationships too, because make sure they're serving you. When we go over that a lot in the book, like make sure that they're serving the role that you need them to. Make sure that they're listening to you. Make sure that they're aligned with what your vision is, and not just like, this is the way we do it because this is the way we've always done it. You know, and if they're not, go to them and say, this isn't matching, this isn't vibing with what I need, and give them the chance to fix it. And if they don't be afraid to fire them. Like, go find your own team, find your people. There's lots of great people out there who are gonna really want to be a team, and you need a team. You need to be, like, your voice is just as important as theirs. So you're the guiding force.
Yeah, I would say there's, like, even the term financial advisor or CPA, there's different ways that people operate within that title. And it's just important to find what makes sense for your situation. Like Pam said, there's like tax planners that, you know, forecast taxes ahead of time, and there's tax preparers that just make sure you're in compliance with the IRS. Figuring out what role you need filled, and then if that professional can't fulfill that role, find someone else. And don't be, let's say your spouse has been working with this person for 30 years, and then your spouse passed away. You shouldn't feel bound to that person just because your spouse set you up with them. They, like Pam said, they need to be working for you. So, we already talked about medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, a couple other roles that you'll have to fill out in your estate planning executor. So that's the person that's going to work with the estate planning attorney after you pass away and probate court to make sure that your assets are distributed, or what assets need to be distributed through the will are distributed properly. If it's, let's say, a long drawn out probate process, they're also going to establish things like a probate account, which is just a separate bank account that funds pass through to keep everything separate from your personal money. And then there's a trustee, which is pretty much the same thing, but for a trust. So they're going to look at the trust, they're going to read the rules of the trust, and they're going to say, you know, they're going to bill all the money to the trustees, the beneficiaries of the trust, sorry. Yeah, the beneficiaries. And they're going to read the rules and make sure that everyone's in compliance with the rules of the trust. They're going to be responsible for the taxes of the trust if there are any things like that. And then lastly, a super important one, this is people usually get hung up on when they're doing their estate plan, and they don't end up doing estate plans because of the guardianship. They don't know who to make guardians of their kids and even their pets, right? So you can have guardians for your pets too. And with all of these, right, it's important to not get stuck on one thing and to let that delay the entire process. If you know your power of attorney that you want to just do that document, right? That's one document of the entire process. You don't need to wait and have everything buttoned up to do anything. You can work on stuff that you know the answers to now, and then come back to the other stuff that's a little harder, like guardianship. So incomplete estate plans, these are some of the issues that we see. Number one being probate. So a good estate plan will have the least amount of assets probated as possible. Okay, so you're going to use things like a trust or beneficiary designations to pass those assets outside of probate. So the way the beneficiary designation works, right? Let's say it's life insurance, and the policyholder dies, and they have their beneficiary as their spouse. The spouse only needs to produce a death certificate to that company, and then they automatically send money to that person. Super simple, doesn't need to be probated, and it can, sometimes it can take as little as like 3 days. So they can get their money really quickly. Anything, let's say they had a life insurance policy and it didn't have any beneficiary designation, well, that would go to the estate. And then from the estate, the estate planning attorney, and the executor and a judge with the probate court is going to sit down, read the will, and then the judge is ultimately the decision maker, and they're going to distribute the assets based on what they're reading in your documents, right? And so they might decide something that you didn't want to have happen to your estate, but you're not there, so you can't advocate for yourself, right? So you want to make sure everything's set up in the easiest way possible to move assets to heirs in the way that you want to. Another problem with probate, it can be costly. If there's some like knockout, drag out fight between cousins or whatever, the probate process can drag on and on and on. And it's also public, so anybody with access to the court record can see the money that went to your heirs. Okay, so that can set your heirs up for ill will people, right, with lawsuits or creditors or ex-spouses, anything like that. So if we can keep that out of the public eye through things like a trust or beneficiary designation, that's the way to go. Like I said, it could be lengthy. It's not terrible in Georgia, in most of the southeastern states, but in like the northeast, it's awful. Like they can go months and months or years. Okay, so making sure that you have out-of-state properties that we're probably going to need a trust at that point just to streamline the process. And then, like I said, at least unintended outcomes. If the judge is deciding, they might decide something that you didn't actually want to happen. And then lastly, like I said, you might need an estate account. So your executor can have to open a separate bank account. It's just another issue with the probate process. Next is cash flow issues. And this is something that's really scary that we see a lot. So let's say in Pam's situation, right, John was the money guy, right? And they had their finances set up where Pam did have access to money. But a lot of people don't. So for a lot of people, if their spouse is in charge of the money, then the credit cards are in their name, the bank accounts are in their name, and when that person passes away, they lose all their liquidity. So they might be super wealthy on paper, but they can't actually get access to credit or cash or anything, and then they're in a position where they're struggling to pay the bills while they're waiting for the assets to be probated. So we want to make sure that mainly your spouse has access to liquidity in the interim while you're waiting for the probate process to wind down, so that they can maintain their lifestyle, right? They can pay the bills, they're not going to lose a house, anything like that. They're also going to sometimes be waiting on Social Security to kick in. That should take, how long does that take for you?
Just getting her on the phone.
Yeah.
Was insane. 6 months?
Yeah. So, yeah, you might have Social Security income coming in, but you're going to be waiting a long time for it to actually kick in. And then lastly, the widow tax. So this.
Let me add one more thing on that. Authorized users don't count as being an owner on the account, and I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, when her husband passed away, I'll talk about this later too, but she thought she was doing the right thing. She called the credit card companies, and she was like, he died, and literally as she's on the phone, she gets a text that says your account's closed down.
Yeah.
And she's like, did you just close the account? And they said, yeah, the owners passed away. And so immediately all of her credit cards were gone. She was an authorized user. Yeah.
Very scary. And then all that is compounded with like you're in grief mode and you're not making any decisions already, and then you have the added financial stressors and like add to that. So if we can avoid that, then that's the best there. The widow tax, so that's not a formal tax of the IRS charges. Okay, so they don't just tax widows. But what this references is, but the other Social Security goes away. So your income is reduced, right? What we tend to see is that most people's lifestyles don't actually decrease that much when one spouse passes away. So the surviving spouse is spending about the same amount of money, and they're going from married filing jointly to single. Okay, so their tax bracket, their taxes that they pay are increasing, their income's going down, and their lifestyle is maintained at the same spending levels. And so what they end up having to do is taking money out of IRA or 401k that just adds more taxable income when they're already in a higher tax bracket. So they end up just paying a lot more in taxes than when their spouse was alive when they were having 2 Social Security incomes. So that's the widow tax. The way around that, right, is to pre-plan and working with the tax planner, and a lot of that has to do with converting money from IRA to Roth IRA and getting that out of taxable income into tax-free income. But that's something that you have to do over a long period of time because you can't just do it in 1 or 2 years. Otherwise, you blow up your taxes in that 1 or 2 years. So it's something to forecast and think about, like long-term, doing, $20,000, $30,000 a year from that IRA or Roth IRA. I don't know if I would misinherit theirs.
Saying that because that was a problem we had, not that any of my children disinherited. However, going back to that will that we finally found in the state that I couldn't get into, the will was very outdated. And my youngest child, when John passed away, was 12, and he wasn't in will. So we never updated the will that I know of. I mean, I feel like knowing John Baker, he did, but I don't know where it is. Our attorney didn't have it. And so Duncan, had anything happen to both of us at the same time, then Duncan wasn't even included in our will. So I guess that he didn't exist. So, slightly, sorry. He was a favorite, so it should be 2.
Beneficiary designations, like I said, these are really important to update and maintain because they supersede all those documents that we've talked about. And you can, usually do these online or phone, or probably not on the phone. You can do them online with the same Google one. And you can add these to your accounts. So accounts with beneficiary designations are things like IRAs, Roth IRAs, 401k, 403b, life insurance, and qualified annuities. And then the TODs, it functions the same way, it's just a different name. So it stands for payable on death, transfer on death. And you can put those on bank accounts, taxable investment accounts, non-qualified annuities, and now on Georgia real estate. So when you pass away, all your beneficiary has to do is produce a death certificate to the financial institution, and then those assets will be transferred to an account in their name. And it's really easy and really simple to get their money a lot faster than if you just left your IRA to your state.
So what's a qualified and non-qualified? What's the difference?
Yeah, so qualified is going to be IRA, Roth IRA, any retirement account, and then non-qualified is taxable, so they're usually in your name. So it'll say like the account will be called like Pam Baker. I don't know if you know that, but you'll have like a taxable investment account or a joint with rights of survivorship. That's another common taxable account. So those are non-qualified, and then qualified is anything with a like retirement account tax treatment. So your like 401k IRA. That's the 2 different.
How do you do POD or TOD on real estate?
It's through a deed. So it's a TOD deed, and I haven't personally done one.
If you want to do that, maybe you might already have it, depending on how you're holding the property, if you're joint tenants or tenants in common, but you would go just through a closing attorney and make that a TOD.
Did you have any? I forgot to preview on this. Do you have anything now?
No. You do that when you're buying, when you're closing on your new place.
You could do it. But again, you might be holding it, depending on how you're holding the property. So there's several things that you have to kind of line up.
If you held a joint, I wouldn't really worry about it. If
Right.
it's single, then I would definitely look into adding it.
For sure. And the other nice thing about that is with all properties, of course, once it does transfer, it gets reassessed at your time of death, so your heirs aren't paying it at your acquisition cost. They're acquiring it at whatever that appraisal is when you pass. So,
We'll get into that.
yeah.
A lot of tax savings. So an example of people accidentally disinheriting their heirs and they don't even know it. So they think they're doing the right thing, they set up the beneficiary designation, and then it bites them per sturbies and per capita. And you might see those on the form that you fill out. You might not know what they mean. So per sturbies means by the roots in Latin. So if you want to think about how the assets transfer down, it's like a tree root. So it goes down the levels of your inheritance. Per capita means by the head. Okay, so for most people, what they want is per sturbies, but they might fill out per capita. So under per sturbies, Barb is the account owner, and then she has 3 kids, Jay, Grace, and Hunter, and Jay predeceases her, and Barb forgets to update her beneficiary designations. Well, when Barb passes away, Jay's share of the assets will go to his 2 kids, and they can win. That's how most people would like their assets transferred. They would want it to go to the grandkids of the kids that passed away. Under per capita, right, if, let's say, same scenario, Barb names the 3 kids, Jay passes away first, then Barb passes away. Well, now it's by the head, so the 2 remaining siblings get 50-50, and the grandkids are cut out. And now we're in a weird situation with the aunt and uncle. We're like, are they going to do the right thing and give the kids the money, or that makes people really weird. So we want to take all of those decisions off the table, and if Barb wants the grandkids to have it, that's how she needs to have it set up, and not rely on Grace and Hunter being benevolent and uncle and giving their share to the grandkids. Any questions with that? Just 2 terms you might see. And it's weird because some companies will default to one or the other, and you will have to know, I want first service or I want. So trust. Like I said, there's a million different flavors of trust. You can set them up. The 2 main categories are revocable, which means you can change them very easily while you're alive. I don't want to say very easily, but pretty easily. And then irrevocable. Irrevocable is its own entity. So it gets its own social security number or tax ID number, and it's very difficult to change once you have it in place. So any assets that you put in there are no longer technically yours. They belong to the trust. People usually will use an irrevocable trust if they're trying to get assets out of their name, if they have a lot of cash or taxable investments, because they have a lot of liability with, like, let's say someone trying to sue them over a car accident. Right? So they would move those assets into the irrevocable trust, and now if they get sued, they can say, well, it's not mine, it's the trust. Okay? Most people are going to be using the revocable trust because that's, if you have a marital trust or anything like that, it's going to be revocable. It provides control from the grave, is what I like to say. So you can set up your trust to dictate any rule